From JoJo to Soho, Thomas and Mackenzie really is doing it all. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today our movie in the middle is Last Night in Soho. Last Night in Soho is Edgar Wright's newest movie about a girl who travels to London to study fashion and ends up seeing visions of events that took place in the 1960s. It stars Thomas Mackenzie, Anya Taylor-Joy, Matt Smith, Michael Ajayo, Diana Rigg, and Terrence Stamp. Starting off with the highs, the look of this movie is incredible. I feel like that's something I just have been saying in every single one of my reviews this year, is that the cinematography is one of the highs. The lights, the colors, everything is just, it really immerses you, in this world, not only in the present, but especially in the 1960s London. It really pulls you into like the nightlife of London in the 1960s, and it feels so classy and really cool, and just that something that you just want to be a part of. And then at the same time, it's really interesting because whereas earlier in the movie, it lures you in, later in the movie, when things start to take a turn and tragedy starts to strike, it becomes very overwhelming. It doesn't really change, it just becomes overwhelming now, and you're like, I want it to stop. And so it was a really cool distinction. The acting, too, was, I thought, pretty on point. Thomas and Mackenzie did a really good job, considering I think this is the first movie that she's been the main character of, and especially considering she was alongside Anya Taylor-Joy, and she was still sort of the main focus of the movie. She did a really good job carrying it. Also, too, because the story calls for her to be freaking out a lot, because people don't believe her that she's seeing all of these things, and she's kind of going insane, and she did a really good job with that. I honestly really liked her character, and I loved following her throughout all of this. Anya Taylor-Joy was, of course, awesome as well. She actually is not in it as much as I thought she was going to be, or she's not as much as the focus, but for the parts that she is in, she's amazing. She basically, I feel like, has become the person after Queen's Gambit who is in a movie just to be there. Her presence is just pretty much all you need. And for the couple of scenes that she's in, I thought she did a really great job. I wanted more of her, but you know what? For the fact that it really wasn't her movie, it's okay. I also love that there is a character in this movie that is just a good person. There's no angle. There's no catch. They're just a good person. On the other end of the spectrum, there's just a person who's there to just be a bitch. There's nothing that happens to them. There's no consequences. They start out as a bitch, and they end the movie as a bitch, and that's it. And I thought that was really funny. The story itself was really intriguing. Actually, I think that's part of the reason that it was my #1 most anticipated movie of this year, was because we had no idea really what this movie was about going into the trailers, because they barely, except for I think maybe in the second trailer, really describe what was actually going on, and it just looked really cool. I knew it was going to be a horror. I knew it was going to be by Edgar Wright, and I really loved all the actors who were in it, so I was really excited for it. The story ended up being different than what I thought it was going to be, but it was still really impactful, I would say, because the horror elements of it, there are some things in it that are strictly, this is a horror. And then there are some things that are like, this is a horror, but like a real life horror, and only some people deal with this real life horror on a daily basis, so I obviously won't ruin what it is, but it was, I think, very well done in terms of its metaphor, and it was just something I hadn't really seen before, so that itself was pretty cool. I do have a middle element, and that is that it does not feel like an Edgar Wright movie. It was really cool thinking he was going to do a straight up scary horror movie with his style. His style really isn't in it that much. You can't really pick it up. And on one hand, it's really weird judging a movie based on what you thought it was going to be because of a director's style. Because, like, if it's still a good movie, you can't discount that the director's style wasn't in there. They're just doing something different. But it was still a good movie. But on the other hand, I'm going into an Edgar Wright movie. I want to see Edgar Wright in it. So it was kind of weird. I wanted to see that. I can understand if it's not there, especially because it is a horror and his style lends itself to more action and comedy, because he's done things like, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Baby Driver, and the Cornetto trilogy, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End, which I actually just saw all of them, so it was cool. I was able to catch up on all of his stuff. But then that made it even more disappointing when I didn't really see any of his like quick zooms or interesting transitions or anything like that. There was definitely some very cool shots in here and things that was like, oh, that was pretty slick. But it's not even like Baby Driver, where it was more of a serious movie, but it still had some really great edits and his style in it. It just didn't have as much of that. It did, however, have a pub, so that's how you know it's an Edgar Wright movie. For my lows, I was surprisingly not bored by the movie, but some of the scenes I felt were a little repetitive. This kind of goes along with what the story is. You know, she has this vision, and then we see her do stuff during the day, and then at night she has another vision. You know, so it kind of alternates. But it just felt like the first half of the movie is one thing, and it's kind of repetitive. The second half of the movie is a different thing, and it's kind of repetitive. So throughout, I was like, okay, you know, I get it. You know, it makes sense with what the story is, but for me, it was just a little back and forth too much. The visions themselves are also not explained terribly well. Not like what happens in the visions, but what Thomasin McKenzie's character thinks they are. I don't think I ever really understood what she thinks of these and how she's reacting to them. She just kind of accepts that she's just having these visions randomly. I don't know if she thinks that they're a dream or if she thinks that she's hallucinating or what, but she kind of doesn't really have a reaction to it, which is kind of weird. And lastly, there are things at the end of this movie that are just not resolved at all. Like, it kind of ties up in a nice, neat little bow after the climax, but there are like 3 or 4 things I could think off the top of my head that just, I'm like, well, what about this? What about that? Did they ever find out? Did they ever? And there's one specific thing that I'm like, definitely needed to be addressed. Something that like was a very serious thing closer to the end of the movie that was never brought up again. And it's really weird that they don't. So overall, Last Night in Soho was really intriguing, was a really cool story, did have a really great look. Everything about it that I was excited for pretty much was there. It just has some weird things about it story-wise and in terms of structure that just didn't quite hit, I think. You know, I feel like Edgar Wright was so focused on 2 to 3 elements of this that he was so excited about. He really put those, you know, in here with his all, and then forgot to focus on other things or forgot to take into account other things in terms of the story and the structure. I feel like it's one of those movies that watching it a second time around, now that I know where it goes and what it's about, it'll probably be a lot better. I'm going to give Last Night in Soho a 3 out of 4. Guys, let me know what you thought of Last Night in Soho. It was definitely an intriguing looking movie, but I want to know what your thoughts were because it definitely seems like a movie that a lot of people could like and a lot of people could be like, it was okay. Definitely worth a watch though, at least once through. And as always, keep your hopes high, your stress low, and movies right in the middle. I'll see you guys later.